to another episode of the Pakistan Experience. You already know Michael Kugelman now. He needs no introduction. How are you doing, Michael?
Doing great, thanks. Hope you are as well.
Yes, let's jump straight into it. India launched a missile into Pakistan as somebody with some respect. I'm not sure if you would be able to say it. So I'll say it and I'll get your analysis on it. I think India is lying that it was an accident. I don't think these accidents happen. I think they were testing Pakistan's capacity to defend. What's your take? I think Pakistan has had a mature response, but the world is taking it a lot more lightly than they should. This is a serious breach.
Yeah, so absolutely agree with you. A very serious breach. And, the fact that it's unlikely that Pakistan would have had the capacity to intercept or shoot this missile down, given how quickly it was traveling. I mean, it traveled almost 80 miles into the country in under 4 minutes. I mean, this is a supersonic missile, likely an Indian BrahMos cruise missile. This is serious stuff. And yeah, absolutely. I think that, but we're very lucky that both sides dodged a bullet. I credit Pakistan, quite frankly, for the way it responded. The response it gave was very measured. You probably saw there have been a few reports, including Bloomberg, among others, have claimed that Pakistan initially tried to contemplate some type of retaliation, but it didn't do that. Of course, that's based on unnamed sources, as is so typically the case these days. So yeah, it could have been real serious. In terms of whether it really was a mistake, no, I think it's certainly, I can understand the speculation that it was not a mistake, given that, quite frankly, India's safety record on its missile supplies is fairly strong. So it is quite striking that, after many years of this really strong record, all of a sudden you have this incredibly egregious mistake, so to speak, where, a missile was launched into Pakistan during quote unquote routine maintenance, according to the Indian government readout. And yeah, the fact that this was an unarmed missile, as well as the fact that the Indians did not initially notify Pakistan about what had happened, that all adds up to, I think, the possibility that this could have been something other than a mistake. Of course, I'm in no position to say what the case was or not. I think that one can certainly claim that it would have been a mistake, because mistakes happen. And India has given not a very detailed, but somewhat of a detailed assessment as to what exactly went wrong. It hasn't said much more beyond that. But who knows? And you know what? I imagine that you and I and most others in the world will probably never know exactly what happened and the full story. But my bottom line here is that I certainly acknowledge those that think that this was not a mistake for the reasons that I mentioned.
I don't think India has given a detailed reason. They just said it's a mistake. Plus, if you notice the
you're very well prepared here.
It changed directions midway. So unless that's programmed, I don't think once it's launched, it can't do that. So it does look very, very sketchy the way it all happened. And the fact that it says, there wasn't a nuclear warhead on it, where there could have been. So it really does seem like they were testing our capacity, and especially with Putin's excursions into Ukraine, I do feel India might feel a little emboldened to try something like this. And I know I might get into trouble for saying this, but ISPR is trying to save itself by saying we had intercepted it, we were tracking it, but more than likely they were made aware of it after it already entered into Pakistan, and they lacked the capacity to actually shoot it down.
Yeah, and on that I agree with you. And I have spoken to some Pakistani defense experts who know a lot more about these types of technicalities than I do, and they have acknowledged that indeed Pakistan really wouldn't have the ability to shoot something like this down, which makes it all the more concerning and gets to the broader issue of how lucky we are that things were not worse. If this was February 2019 or even any time in 2020 when tensions were pretty high in the relationship, I don't necessarily think that Pakistan's response would have been quite as measured. So, and of course, we're lucky that there were no deaths, right? That there were no deaths on the ground, that there were no commercial airliners that were hit by this missile. We're very fortunate in this regard. But yeah, and of course, it hasn't gotten much attention globally, given that the world's attention is focused on Ukraine, rightly so. But yeah, quite a story.
I think Jen Psaki acknowledged it.
Oh, is that right?
I think Jen Psaki said that we have noticed that it happened. Little more than that. I mean, they did not even rebuke India. Um, I think she just, even on the Ukraine-Russia crisis, there wasn't a strong rebuke. I believe Jen Psaki just said history will look at it. History will look at it unfavorably. It is most definitely troubling, and I think generally the war drums are beaten by both the Pakistan and the Indian media, and constantly the blame is put on the other side. And I've been quite critical of the Pakistani military, and I've been quite vocal, much to my own peril as well at times. But if we look at the recent incidents, whether it's Abhinandan, whether it's this missile, whether it's Kashmir, I think Pakistan has had opportunities to retaliate and it has chosen not to. So even people in India who are listening to this, I think we've shown a maturity and we've shown a stance that we're against war. Whereas I think India is getting emboldened and this might become dangerous.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is true. And I think that Pakistan has been, especially when you look at the Balakot crisis, the way in which that ended with the release of Abhinandan and all of that, I think that one can give some credit to Pakistan in that regard. But I mean, at the end of the day, I don't want to risk provoking an angry response, but, you know, India is the larger, more powerful state. Its conventional military forces, generally speaking, are superior to those of Pakistan. So obviously, Pakistan has used asymmetric means to push back against India over the years. Nuclear weapons, of course, is a big factor. But my point is that Pakistan certainly would need to be cautious in terms of how far it may want to go. But it did retaliate. I mean, after the Balakot incident, after those Indian airstrikes, it didn't get much press coverage globally, but Pakistan did retaliate by sending a very, as I recall, a single airstrike into a non-populated area in Indian-ministered Kashmir, as I recall. Didn't hurt anyone, didn't get much attention, but I think that was meant to send a message. Do you remember what I'm talking about?
No, I don't.
Ah, see, there you go. But anyway, my point is that Pakistan does need to be cautious in these contexts. And I think also Pakistan is, global perception issues are important for Pakistan. I think that Islamabad is very concerned about trying to convey this idea that it's a responsible actor. And I think it wants to try to contrast itself from the Indian government, which it routinely describes as fascist and so on. And it understands that Pakistan's global image is still much worse than India's is. And quite frankly, because of a number of very concerning things that have happened over the last few decades, particularly in terms of Pakistan's relationship with certain terrorist groups and so on. So I think that's another factor to keep in mind, that Pakistan is always wanting to keep a global audience in mind and wanting to project this idea that it's the more responsible, restrained country compared to India.
I mean, isn't that every single country in the world? Aren't we all trying to do that same thing? Even if we talk about the US, the jihadi groups that you're talking about, that Pakistan has been in bed with, I will openly acknowledge that the funding for that started from the US.
Right. No, of course. I mean, you can make that argument about many countries, but again, Pakistan has this image problem that it has sought to overcome in recent years, and I think that the powers that be feel a particularly strong incentive to try to push back against that and show that Pakistan is responsible, that it's peace loving, and so on. And there's still a very skeptical audience, particularly in the West. Well beyond India, but yeah, I see your point. You can make that argument about most countries.
The skepticism may be justified, but again, I think which country has an image problem, that's also dependent on global and foreign policy. So if we do talk about Russia and Ukraine, absolutely what Putin is doing is wrong, and nobody over here is in favor of war. But when the US bombed Iraq, there were no sanctions. When the US helped fund different wars all over the world, there were no sanctions. So global policy and global perceptions are more about relationships and who has the power, as opposed to any moral principles, or at least that's what it seems like.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've had this discussion many times over the last few months that the United States has initiated a number of wars of choice, and it's interesting that many Biden administration officials have referred to Putin's war as a war of choice. I don't think that's a very good phrase to use because that sort of it brings to mind all of these American wars of choice, especially the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan to an extent. I would argue that the Russian invasion of Ukraine is much more serious and egregious than either of those American wars. But still, there are better ways of describing what Putin has done than calling it a war of choice, which almost seems to sort of cast it in a less serious, concerning tone. But yeah, obviously, the U.S. history shows many cases of aggressions, of invasions, and as you say, I mean, the way the world is structured and the way power dynamics work, there's always going to be a certain type of response in this context. But I'll say this: I think that it would be wrong to argue that it's only the West that is sort of behind the U.S. and what it's doing and how it's reacted to the Russian invasion. You look at the UN General Assembly vote; you had so many countries in the developing world that voted in favor of that resolution condemning the invasion. And I know that you had several dozen countries that abstained, including 4 in South Asia, which is fine. But this is not just a war of the West or a war that's sort of animated and emboldened the West, so to speak. I mean, there has been global condemnation for what's happened, as there should be.
I think the UN General Assembly vote is just as free as Pakistani elections. People vote based on their relationships, what is due from who, and even to create some pressure on India. What US said was, you buy a lot of weapons from us. So it's not, I would argue that most countries are probably not taking a moral stance. They're taking a foreign policy relations stance when they're voting.
Sure. Well, of course, and that's how the world works. I mean, international relations are driven by interest, not by morality, and that certainly stands for the U.S. And I think it stands for most countries too, right? I think you'd have to go back to maybe the Jimmy Carter administration when you last had a U.S. president that actually pursued foreign policy based on moral considerations as opposed to interest, and even there were even limits to what he did. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Obviously, even just looking at the 4 South Asian countries that abstained from the UN General Assembly vote, well, they had their reasons because they either have close friendships with Russia, or they want to have a closer friendship with Russia, or they've depended on Russia for financial support, or they have some trade relationships with Russia. Absolutely, that's the way it goes. But note that even those 4 countries did not oppose the resolution; they abstained, and there's a difference there.
Do you notice shades of McCarthyism in the US right now? Because there's also an American scholar who's repeatedly argued for the fact that Ukraine and NATO are to blame for the war, and it's NATO that's creating the conditions for this war. And then there was a Twitter trend to rebuke that scholar or to ban that scholar. And Russian literature is being banned from certain universities. I just saw a tweet that Slack has deleted business accounts of average Russians where Russian businesses have lost a lot of data. I don't think this is effective because this will only fuel Putin's propaganda, the binary that he's creating with the West and Russia. It will only fuel that. B, do you now see how believable McCarthyism was because you're seeing it happen in 2022 despite movies like Trumbo?
Well, no, you make some very good points there. I do not think that we're seeing a return of McCarthyism, but absolutely, I would agree with you that I think that the West, and particularly the US, are going much too far in terms of cracking down on Russians, on private citizen Russians. I mean, the fact that you have these musical maestros performing in major US orchestras, Russians that have been forbidden from participating in that just because they're Russians. I think that's absolutely wrong. And this gets to, and I should say that in the US, there's so many Russians that are very prominent in popular culture and sports, hockey. I don't know if you follow hockey, but there's some of the biggest stars in the National Hockey League here are Russians. Now, one of them, the biggest one, who happens to be a star for the local team in Washington, the Washington Capitals, he happens to be an avowed supporter of Putin. His name is Alex Ovechkin. That's sort of different. But then you have so many other athletes and musicians who happen to be Russian, who are being told that they they can't do what they used to. They can't do their jobs anymore because they're Russians. That's a mistake. And that gets to a broader point that I think is important to acknowledge here when looking at this whole Russia-Ukraine crisis from a US domestic political lens. I would argue that on many levels, the Cold War never really ended. Yes, when the Cold War formally ended, you had a period during the 1990s when you had, in the Yeltsin era and the Clinton era, when you had a growing relationship between the US and Russia. There was pathways for cooperation. But then once Putin came to power, we get into the early 2000s, the tensions resurfaced. And Putin, of course, had been very concerned about NATO expansion from the start. The US was very much behind NATO expansion, of course. And so tension soon returned to this relationship to the point that it's not just political diplomatic relations, but popular perceptions of Russia in the United States have been very negative, quite negative. It sort of reminds me of Iran, of perceptions of Iran. And so then, we got to more recent period when the Russians annexed Crimea several years ago. That ratcheted things up even more. And then the real kicker was the 2016 election, when, of course, the Democratic Party here accused Russians of meddling and preventing Hillary Clinton from getting elected, leading to the election of Donald Trump. And we now have a Democratic administration in power now. So my point is that there's sort of cultural and political factors here in the United States as well that I think have added fuel to the fire, so to speak, that have sort of contributed to this especially hard line being taken not only toward Putin and Moscow, but toward Russians on the whole, which is not right and which is not fair. So I think that's important context to keep in mind when we hear all these very unfortunate stories about Russian athletes and musicians getting booed or harassed, or Russian nationals in the U.S. basically being told that they can't do their jobs anymore. We had a famous Russian restaurant in D.C. that basically had to shut down because there was all these anger and protests and threats. So it's just a shame, but it gets to this broader issue of the Cold War never really having ended here.
If the US wants to boycott Russian vodka and they want to send it to Pakistan, I'd be more than glad to take it. If you want to dump Russian vodka into Pakistan, I'll take it. Fine, US, I accept.
I'll be sure to tell the relevant authorities here about that. So.
But don't you think, nobody can argue that I'm a Republican or I can support the Republican Party, but the Democratic Party has also been quite stupid in their messaging. This idea that Putin is this bad guy or Putin is like Hitler, I don't think it does them any favors as well, because the large portion of America does not see this in the nuanced way that they should. They simply see Putin as the bad guy. And I love Colbert, but this constant messaging about the PP tape, Trump being Putin's, I won't use the word, but you know what I mean. It does normal America no favors, because they start seeing this world in that simplistic Marvel binary of us being Captain America and us being the good guys. This isn't D-Day, this isn't Normandy. They don't really understand why Putin is doing and what he's doing it for. And they simply come to the conclusions Russian is equal to bad, and it's a Red Scare all over again.
Right. Yeah. It gets back to the point that you had made earlier. I frankly think there's no other way to refer to Putin than as a bad guy, quite frankly. I mean, given what he's done, and not even allowing humanitarian convoys to get into major cities in the Ukraine, it's horrific. So I'm not gonna make any excuses.
I'm not saying Putin is a good guy. I'm saying what Trump said when he was asked if Putin is the bad guy. He was like, "Do you think we're the good guys? Do you think we haven't done anything?"
That was a pretty good impression right there.
China.
Yeah, no, but yeah, of course, President Trump, it's just a whole other story for sure. But, it's interesting that if you look back, there have been some notable cases of very senior US figures on the Republican side expressing sort of these personal affinities for Putin. I think the most famous case, right, was George W. Bush, who said, I think after meeting Putin at one point, when I looked into his eyes, I could see his soul, something like that. I don't think George W. Bush is known for being a romantic. That's quite an impressive thing to say.
The painter in him had awakened at that point.
Yes, exactly. Maybe he got inspiration. Though I'm not aware of any Putin paintings that Bush has done in recent years.
Even Rudy Giuliani has been quite, uh, you know, lyrical about Putin's praises. Tucker Carlson, who has the largest microphone in the Republican Party, even though he's not part of the Republican Party, but he espouses Republican values, or at least pretends to. He's been very pro-Putin. Trump was very pro-Putin. So there is that romanticism with that strong leader that the Republican Party has had with Putin.
And I think all that it is sort of politically driven. I think that perhaps some of these very prominent right-wing Republican figures in the United States would want to distinguish their views from those of the Democratic Party, and particularly, the administration, at a moment when the administration is going full bore and trying to go after Putin and certainly crack down on Russians on the whole. So I think that could be part of it as well. But indeed, it is striking that particularly some of the conservative media personalities here in the US have been really saying things that sound like Putin talking points, quite frankly, including a few presenters on Fox News. Again, I think we should keep the domestic political context in mind. But yeah, Putin certainly has his supporters and his admirers. That's the way it goes. And of course, we could talk about India, where there's so much nostalgia for the relationship with Russia, going back to the early days of the Cold War, where indeed, I think that you do have some individuals that may not wholly endorse the invasion, but certainly would be in a position to want to cut some slack for Putin. And India is not the only place.
I think there is a romanticism with the Soviet Union, but there's also an idea to have two big dogs in the yard, so the US is kept in check. I think that's also a tactful policy why some people want to see a resurgence of the Soviet Union. I'm not saying I do. I'm saying some people on the left and the traditional classic Marxist model. The thing that you say, that looking at it from a domestic lens, I think I would argue that's the only lens US politicians look at it from, not alleging any foul play, but anytime the president's approval ratings are critically low, there seems to be a war, there seems to be an airstrike. And even at this point, when war has kicked off, Biden's ratings were shockingly low when it happened. One should be skeptical of how coincidental these things are.
Well, that's an interesting perspective there. I see your point, and indeed, you're right that domestic politics is a huge influence on U.S. foreign policy. But at the end of the day, it was the Russians that were mobilizing nearly 200,000 troops, and it was the Russians that invaded the Ukraine on false pretexts and historical grievances that don't exist, and so on. So, and the U.S. was reacting to that, and of course, getting beyond the issue of the Cold War never having ended. We're talking about an invasion right on the periphery of the NATO presence, right? So it's understandable, I think, that the U.S. and other NATO countries reacted in the way that they did, even though I think they went overboard on some levels, as I had mentioned earlier.
I think we'd get into a chicken and egg argument if we talk about provocation, propaganda of the Russians are coming and the Russians are coming, and becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy when you say the Russians will attack on Tuesday, the Russians will attack. Let's not get into that. But when Putin responds by saying, what if we put nuclear missiles in Mexico, how do you think the US will react? He does have a point when he says that. So if Ukraine becomes a part of NATO and missiles are put by the US, we're already in the periphery of Russia, the US has put missiles. The US will not respond kindly if Russia puts missiles in Mexico. We all know what happened in the Cuban Missile Crisis, and gladly people showed restraint there. But Putin has a point when he says that.
Absolutely. I think it is important to acknowledge the lens through which the other side, so to speak, would look at what's happened over the last few decades there, for sure. But, that said, NATO had been very open to dialogue with the Russians on this whole expansion thing for many years, and even in the lead up to the actual invasion, the U.S. was holding out the option of negotiation and diplomacy to try to figure out how to de-escalate. So, but yes, you're right. Absolutely, I think that it's important to acknowledge why the Russians were so concerned about what had been happening on its periphery for so many years. Absolutely, but that certainly does not justify a cold-blooded invasion, in my humble opinion.
No, absolutely not. Nothing justifies a cold-blooded invasion. But in terms of the messaging, that's what I mean when you say Putin good guy, Putin bad guy, we the good guys. It robs the people of understanding all these nuances that, oh, there was a way for negotiation. And I would argue that Russia has used US's playbook. It may be completely false propaganda, but the idea that the neo-Nazis, American shills that have been installed in Ukraine, and the Ukrainian people actually want democracy. So I'm not surprised this idea that Russians are dumb. That's why they believe Putin's propaganda. But then people in the US signed up for the war in Iraq on similar pretenses. So this idea that we're bringing democracy to Ukraine, that's what Putin would argue. I get it sounds foolish, but it's right from US's playbook.
No, this is true. This idea of manufacturing the idea of sort of being a liberator. Consent. Right. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. I certainly acknowledge your point for sure. But again, there are ways. There were opportunities. Putin was given opportunities to be able to work things out with the U.S. And the NATO alliance. Even as you know, up to the last few days before the invasion, President Biden had said that he was ready to sit down and have a summit with Putin, if only he were to hold back and not invade. But Putin wasn't interested in that. Clearly, he reached a point where he had no interest in talking, and he had made up his mind that he was going to launch this invasion that has not gone very well from a tactical point of view to this point. But I certainly acknowledge your point, and I'm not trying to excuse these U.S. excesses and aggressions of the past, especially the war in Iraq. I think that stands out. I would distinguish that from the war in Afghanistan. Very different context, very different motivations. But yeah, the war in Iraq was based on false intelligence about the idea of Iraq having nuclear weapons. And it's very hard to justify that war. So I certainly acknowledge that, and that the U.S., one could argue, is hypocritical for sure. And I definitely will not. I definitely would not reject that argument by any means. That's very clear.
So when the U.S. asks for acquiescence from South Asian country, and I don't think Imran Khan should say that because he's the prime minister and he should be more diplomatic, but a person like me can say it who has no states and don't represent anything in Pakistan. That's the problem, right? When you're supporting Israel, when even something as small as the Premier League, flying a Palestinian flag, players were rebuked for that you shouldn't involve politics in the Premier League. And now the Premier League logo is the Ukrainian flag. Not to say people shouldn't support people in Ukraine. They absolutely do. They're fighting for this country and more power to them. Especially that clip about telling the warship to F off. I particularly enjoyed that. But the problem is when the US funds Israel, helps them with their defense system, and the world turns a blind eye to Palestine. And then suddenly Russia invades Ukraine, and now all these moral policies, to the extent where some videos from Palestine were shared by people who thought it was Ukraine, and once they find out it was Palestine, they deleted it.
Mm-hmm. Right. So your point is what? That it's not right for the U.S. to be trying to drag countries into this whole war story when it's not their war and so forth. That's basically your point, right? Which I acknowledge.
I think the US is trying to take a moral stance and it's asking for acquiescence based on that. And right. Like you acknowledge that one can argue that the US is being hypocritical. For that fact, countries being neutral, I think it should be their prerogative and they shouldn't be punished for that.
Mm-hmm. Right. No, absolutely. And I certainly agree with that. And it's natural that there would be a tendency on the part of the U.S. to assume that many countries, including those that are not at all impacted by the war, would sort of jump onto the U.S. bandwagon, so to speak, and support this just because it's a terrible thing, because all invasions are terrible, especially this one. It's not, and that comes with the U.S. being a superpower, just sort of taking for granted the idea that it would get a lot of support. And indeed, it certainly is wrong-headed. also keep in mind that one of President Biden's initial and biggest foreign policy goals during this early part of his presidency has been to, in his words, restore alliances and restore US leadership, which he thinks was squandered by the Trump administration. So I think that he, in particular, would want to make a big show of trying to gather more international support, certainly within NATO, but also outside of NATO, to support this this U.S. effort, in an indication that U.S. leadership has returned, so to speak. And I think that the U.S. has been fairly successful with reuniting the NATO alliance, though of course there are still some disagreements about what to do about the sanctioning the Russian energy sector because of how much dependence many EU states have on Russian energy. But I think that beyond that, as I had said before, there are quite a few non-Western states that supported the UN General Assembly resolution. But I think that for those that didn't, and the 30 or whatever that abstained, I think that at this point, the administration has acknowledged that there's not much it can do about that. As I understand it, it did lobby a lot to try to get a number of those countries, including India, as well as Pakistan and some of the others, to sign on to the resolution. They didn't succeed. I think that the U.S. has acknowledged that. But you're right that unfortunately, even when you have this horrific invasion that, from a moral perspective, is just terrible, as we had agreed before, interest, not morality, governs international relations and the decisions that are made within that context. So it would be unrealistic, if not naive, to expect the U.S. to generate the full-scale global consensus about the need to take the U.S.'s position from a strictly moral perspective that this invasion was a horrible thing. If the world were different, if it were more driven by moral considerations, the situation would be different. So yeah, I fully acknowledge your point there. But that said, final point on this, I do think that one could argue that for some countries, particularly India, there are so many reasons to believe that important foreign policy, if not national interest, could be hurt in a big way if this war continues. Just because, India doesn't want Russia to get closer to China, which is going to happen. It doesn't want the US to be distracted from its Indo-Pacific policy of countering China. That's going to happen. So I think that there's also reasons to look at this from the context of, well, plenty of countries outside of the West should still support the US position, not out of immoral considerations, because of interest-based considerations. That applies to India. Of course, it doesn't apply to many of the other countries that abstain, but I think it is important to sort of put that nuanced perspective out there too.
One can argue that during Trump's America First policy, America did cede a lot of ground in foreign relations, and it emboldened certain countries. And this firm moral standing that the US has traditionally had, even if it would just mean a rebuke by the press secretary at the White House or a letter written, that even stopped. The false pretenses of democracy or human rights, that even stopped largely during Trump's era, where it was more about power and acknowledging what power was. But Biden, when you claim that Biden wanted to restore America's position, part of it was telling the world again that we're a superpower, but he was never going to sit down at the table with Putin, even if he expresses an earnest desire to, because during the debates, he constantly attacked Trump for for sitting in the lap of Putin and then, suggesting that there might be a PP tape. And if we look at Biden's early career as well, he was quite instrumental in putting NATO together. So he was always going to restore NATO. And once, in an effort to restore NATO, how much of that becomes a direct threat to Putin? And it's sort of like provoking the bear. If you're going to put the stick into the bear, again, not defending Putin, he's a war criminal, much like Israel does war crimes in Palestine. For me, I take a moral stance. I have no interest or I don't represent anybody. So I can take a moral stance on war. But this idea that Biden earnestly wanted to talk to Putin, I'm a little skeptical of. He was always going to embolden NATO because, again, a lot of politics is also about personal relations. And he's had personal relations right from the start of his career with the NATO alliance.
Yeah, so I could acknowledge your point, but I think that my sense is that Biden was genuinely committed to sitting down with Putin and having that summit. if there had not been an invasion, just because Biden didn't want Putin to invade. He didn't want there to be a war. And I think that, yes, you're right. There is his past record, and certainly he was a fervent supporter of NATO expansion, as as all U.S. presidents have been. But I wouldn't place too much importance in what he said on the campaign trail. Much of that can be, a lot of what's said on the campaign trail ends up coming to naught and is contradicted by subsequent behavior when these folks become president. So no, I really think that yes, Biden has criticized Trump for sitting down and talking to dictators, and of course, there's also Biden's democracy promotion idea, which I think is very not dangerous, but I think is very troubling, because when you put yourself out there and say that you're going to try to restore democracy and support democracies, you only underscore the inherent hypocrisy of that idea, because the U.S. is never going to go out and push India or Israel or other key partners to, that too. And then so anyway, that's a side issue. But that said, we have seen a willingness on the part of Biden to take a less polemical position towards some of America's biggest rivals. And I think China is an example. Biden has said from the start that he would welcome cooperation with China where it's possible, particularly in areas like climate change. Iran, but the Biden administration wants to get back into that nuclear accord, which is looking less and less likely. And so that taking that type of conciliatory position, I think, suggests a willingness to engage with the leaders of those countries. And Biden and Putin, they have met, they have engaged. And Biden was actually criticized by many within his own parties for having that meeting with Putin too soon in his administration. So I think that he would have been ready. I think that we would have had that summit between him and Putin. I'm not going to say that would have stopped an eventual Putin invasion, but I really think that he was ready for that. Biden, like Trump, there's not much in common between the two, but I think Biden does, like Trump, value the importance of personal diplomacy. And we live in an era where symmetry is such a big deal. And, it's important for presidents and heads of government to be seen engaging on personal levels. So I think Biden would have had that meeting with Putin. I don't think that it was just a bluff, but we'll never know.
We saw no sanctions. We didn't even see a rebuke. We saw some rebuke when Jamal Khashoggi was murdered, but arms were still thrown to Saudi Arabia. And that's quite a sore point in all foreign policies for everybody, since Saudi oil and Saudi money makes the world go around, whether it be Pakistan, whether it be the US. It might be quite costly to criticize them. You said the Cold War never ended, but if we do talk about maybe the threat levels in the US using that chart, it has definitely moved from yellow to orange, if not red. Do you see this escalation as a potential alliance between China and Russia that will threaten world relations, and we'll see a lot more proxy wars? Or I'm sure Putin anticipated to be much like Crimea. It might have escalated a bit more than that, but do you see it going more towards that way, where Russia just occupies some more areas like Donetsk? I'm not sure if I'm saying that right. And there's another one where there's a lot of pro-Putin support, and the world sort of forgets about it with some sanctions. Or do you see it an escalation towards much more like the Cold War scenario that we saw previously?
Right. Well, I think the only person that knows what direction this war is going to take is Putin himself. And Putin is notoriously inscrutable, and very few people know what's going on in his head other than him. I do worry in the near term that the tactical failures of the Russian invasion, in other words, their inability to take cities quickly, could lead to a sense of desperation that results in even more egregious, indiscriminate type attacks. I really worry about that. I hope it doesn't come to that, but that certainly is a possibility. But I think that so long as the war does not expand beyond Ukraine, I think that eventually there will be an opportunity for de-escalation. Though, of course, if the Russians are able to succeed in taking Ukraine, so to speak, at one point, and there's certainly no guarantee that's going to happen. In fact, I think that would be very difficult. But if that does happen, then clearly, that would, I think, sort of be an inherently and a long-term escalatory threat as perceived by the NATO alliance, right? To have a new government that's a stooge of the Russians, or an actual Russian takeover of Ukraine, a key country that borders NATO states, that would be something that would be difficult to move away from. Now, the NATO alliance has no intention of getting involved in a war taking place inside Ukraine, other than sending military assistance and all of that. No desire to put boots on the ground. I really don't. For all this talk about the possibility of a NATO no-fly zone, I don't think that will fly, so to speak, because again, that risks drawing the NATO alliance into the war. So I think that in terms of the war itself, my sense and my hope is that it will be limited, that it won't escalate anymore. But in terms of the geopolitical implications, that's also hard to say. Certainly, I think it's quite likely that you will see a deeper Russia-China relationship, which to this point has been largely revolves around economic cooperation. But if it's true that, according to some of these recent reports in the U.S. media, that Russia has sought Chinese arms, well, that would signify a whole new ball game, so to speak. And for the U.S. to confront the reality of its two most powerful enemies banding together, that would be very concerning for the U.S. And that would sort of raise questions about what the next step would be. I think that it sort of poses some interesting implications for the U.S. Indo-Pacific policy. Would China pressure Russia to develop more of a presence in Southeast Asia to try to counter the Indo-Pacific program, to strengthen China's own position there? This is all speculation right now. But I do think on a very simple level, if you have a deeper Russia-China relationship, that would certainly pose a new type of challenge for the United States that would raise a lot of questions about the future of the global world order. Now, there have been some discussions about whether the U.S. would seek to enlist China in efforts to get Russia to de-escalate. It's unclear if China is interested in doing that. That could help ease some of the tensions for sure. But bottom line is that I think the biggest geopolitical takeaway from this war is that you're going to have most likely a closer relationship between Russia and China, which has clear implications for the United States and many countries in the West.
I mean, if Ukraine falls, Moldova is inevitable. It's such a tiny country. I think Putin has his eyes on that. I'm not sure if he'll go into Belarus, but I don't think there's any way he's going into Poland. And he's already acknowledged, if NATO says that there'll be a no-fly zone, that'll be a declaration of war. If the US position is that a pro-Russian government in Ukraine will be seen as a threat to NATO, how do they fail to acknowledge that a pro-US government in Ukraine is a threat to Russia?
No, absolutely. You're right. I think that it is important to acknowledge that for sure. But again, thinking about the lens through which the U.S. through which Washington views Russia, its ideas sort of cloaked in this Cold War rhetoric and hostility, I think it would be very important. It would be very unlikely that the U.S. would make that type of acknowledgement. One final point on that, on the scenario of a Ukraine that's taken over by Russia, or a Ukraine with a pro-Russia government. I think that the risk there is that you would have an insurgency, a Ukrainian insurgency
funded by the U.S.
Perhaps that there's a good chance that insurgency would have to be based across the border in Poland, for example, or in some, and that obviously would have implications for the NATO alliance, and it would have implications for the Russians too. So I don't want to sort of give a categorical statement and say, oh, well, if the war only stays in Ukraine, there's nothing more will come of it in terms of how NATO may respond. But yeah, I think that the story wouldn't end. The Ukrainians are not going to just surrender and lie down easily. That's very clear. So some pretty notable implications, even if you have a relatively limited outcome.
I mean, it really does seem to me Ukrainians are being used as a pawn in a much wider global war. If there is a Ukrainian government in exile, most probably it will be in Poland. It will be funded by the US. So the argument that you're making is that if there is a pro-Russian government in Ukraine, then the US will fund an insurgency, which they probably would.
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak to whether they'd fund it, but I think that it would be very difficult to avoid the reality of having a Ukrainian anti-state insurgency based in a neighboring NATO country. That's something, and there are various implications that flow from that for sure.
Oh, it's Afghanistan all over again. And I think even with Kashmir, it's India and Pakistan having a war in Kashmir without ever actually acknowledging what people in Kashmir want. So more power to the people in Ukraine, but I don't think anybody is that interested in what Ukrainians want. Everybody's interested in their personal interests, which most of foreign policy tends to be as far as countries are concerned.
Oh, absolutely, for sure. Yeah, this is true. And you mentioned Afghanistan. I think many of us here in the U.S. have been struck by how there's been these huge outpourings of support for Ukrainians, and the West has agreed to open its borders to Ukrainian refugees. And we know that the story was so different with Afghans, right? After the Taliban takeover, after the U.S. withdrawal, so much hesitancy on the part of the EU states and the US as well to do more to make it easier for Afghan refugees to come out. And is it a double standard? Yeah, absolutely, for sure. You didn't have the Eiffel Tower lighting up in the colors of the Afghan flag, the pre-Taliban flag, after the Taliban takeover. But you're seeing the world, and I think this is a good thing, the world has responded in many ways, in ways that express solidarity with the Ukrainians, and yet we didn't see that when it came to Afghans. Obviously, two different cases for sure, two different conflicts, but I think that here is where you could really see some of these double standards and hypocrisy evidenced by the West when it comes to Ukrainians and when it comes to Afghans, and it really is unfortunate, but that's the reality.
It's tragic and dangerous, but I do think because of COVID and the mental health toll that is taken on people, people are retracting and receding into their primary identities, whether they see themselves as a country or a religion or skin color. And it may be simplistic to say this, but a lot of it is simply about European supremacy or white supremacy, the idea that they look at us. When UK was puncturing boats in the river, leaving refugees to drown, it wasn't an issue. When the Biden administration that wanted to be more empathetic were putting refugees on their borders in cages, when Kamala Harris was like, don't come here, it wasn't a problem. And we saw what happened to Syrian refugees as well, all over Europe. But now there is this entire appeal to humanity about Ukrainian crisis. And we even saw videos where African immigrants in Ukraine were denied entry into the trains and white people were allowed. So it may be simplistic to say this, but a lot of the reaction is simply as simple as saying, oh, they look like us.
Yeah, right, and this has prompted some very, I think, difficult discussions about the role of race, for example, in this whole story, and this idea of so many Western journalists expressing disbelief that you could have bloodshed and conflict in Europe
in a civilized country.
Yeah, it's just a terrible thing to say. I think it's sort of, there's clearly, I basically agree with you. It's wrong. And I think in some cases, these are war correspondents that are reacting in the moment. They're very emotional, but still, that's no excuse. It's just not the way to project these terrible things that are happening, because obviously suffering is a universal reality. It's nothing to do with race. Well, it does in many cases, but it's wrong to have this war projected in that way as something that shouldn't happen in, quote, civilized areas, civilized countries. It's unfortunate.
And it's not just war correspondence. Prince William said something really problematic. I've forgotten exactly what he said, but the whole idea is, we're used to seeing conflict in Asia. We're used to seeing conflict in Middle East. So we're used to seeing Africans dying. But this can happen to us, the idea that this can happen to us, even the idea that this is the most significant war since World War II makes a lot of people in the global South roll their eyes.
Right. No, absolutely. And you look at of course, you look at the history of wars and massacres in Europe over time. Absolutely horrific. So,
Macron's just done a wartime photo shoot despite not being in a war, but whatever France has done, despite waving the flags of liberty and fraternity, what they've done in Africa and the checkered past that they've had, uh, for them to now, act as the vanguards of humanity, it just seems a bit hypocritical. If we can come back to the domestic lens and the domestic messaging and the US media, as critical as I am of the US, unfortunately that is all that I follow. I watch Colbert every day. I love Colbert. I mean, it's your food, that has made me made me fall in love with the US, and I would much rather live in the US than Russia any day. But do you also feel like the media is doing a terrible job? Because at one point they claim that Russia is Hitler and he's going to conquer all of Europe. And in the same breath, they're arguing how the Russian military is antiquated and they're eating potatoes and that's all they have. I think somebody took over a food truck left by Russians and it just had pickles and potatoes. So at one point, they're arguing their tanks don't work. That's why it's come to a stall and the Russian military is antiquated. But at the same time, they're also arguing Putin will take over Europe. How can he do both?
yeah, well, and this is part of the fog of war. So the old saying that truth is one of the first casualties of war. Even when you're on the ground covering it, there's going to be a lot of conflicting. There's going to be a lot of conflicting reports, and I think clearly the best way, as an educated consumer or observer of the war, the best way to get a sense as to what's really going on is not necessarily to follow the media, though certainly that's unavoidable. But the true experts of Russia, of which I am not one. They know who those folks are, and I'm fortunate to have some colleagues at the Wilson Center who follow Russia closely and are very well respected on it. They know what's going on. They have good context, and I think that's the key. Is one should always take media coverage during media coverage of wars with grains of salt, particularly in the early chaotic days of this war, such as what we're experiencing now. It's inevitable that there's going to be contradictions, and of course, social media, which didn't exist during many of the previous wars when truth was still a first casualty, it makes things worse, right? Because if there's something wrong that's reported, that wrong item will be multiplied and people will pick up on it. And so then the lie gets magnified. I shouldn't say it's a lie. Sometimes these are innocent mistakes, but social media makes it all worse for sure.
The big lie. Since you had mentioned the US war in Iraq and the big lie, there have been books and documents that have come out that US intelligence was aware that the big lie was a lie, and still they continued ahead with the war in Iraq. But if we come back to what you're talking about, your colleagues knowing the ground reality, what is their take? What is the ground reality in Russia?
I think the ground reality is that there are different realities in different parts of Russia right now. The most important reality is that people are suffering in a huge way in many cases, and in many areas, humanitarian supplies are having difficulty being delivered. Civilians are getting targeted, including, as you know, several journalists have been killed over the last few days in Ukraine. And that I think another thing that I hear is that we should not assume that just because things appear to be, the Russians appear to be struggling to achieve their goals of taking cities and all, that does not appear that the war effort's going to fail. It's too early to be making that type of prognostication. And as I think I had said before, according to these people that really know what's going on, there is a good chance that Russia could resort to more desperate measures in some areas, using even more aggressive tactics to try to take over areas or make progress in areas where they haven't been able to make progress. And beyond that, people are sort of cautious about not wanting to forecast too far into the future because of simply not knowing what's going to happen. I think that it's important even for experts to acknowledge sometimes that they don't know what's next. There's nothing wrong with humility and saying, well, I don't know what's coming next. Nothing wrong with that.
Putin did allude to threatening nuclear missiles. Is there any truth or veracity to that? of Putin metaphorically and literally using the nuclear option, because that just might be the end of the world as we know it.
The only person that knows the answer to that question is Putin himself. I don't know. I like to assume that it was a big bluff, but he did something that hasn't been done in many years when he put his strategic nuclear forces at a higher level of readiness. Very, very troubling. But I can't imagine it happening. But who knows? But I think that when we talk about the possibility of him feeling more desperate and being willing to resort to more extreme things, I do not believe that refers to the possibility of contemplating nuclear weapons use. I'm talking about more aggressive forms of conventional military power, more indiscriminate bombing and so forth, which is horrific enough for sure. But my goodness, I certainly hope that he wouldn't contemplate that, and I would hope that the U.S. and others would do whatever is possible to lead some type of diplomatic full court press to ensure that we don't get to a position where we have to worry about that.
There's an argument to be made that if you know what Putin is thinking, know what he's accusing others of. And I believe he's accused Ukrainians of using chemical weapons. That's why there's also a lot of fear that if he's projecting that, if he's accusing the other side of using chemical weapons, they might be getting ready to use them. And that, short of the nuclear option, that will also be quite catastrophic, both for the Ukrainian people and global politics.
Exactly. And I know that for the US government, that's the biggest immediate concern, not nuclear weapons, but chemical weapons. And indeed, you're right. This has been the pattern of Putin to create these false pretexts, these false flags to justify doing the very thing that he claims the other side has been doing instead. And this gets to the whole absurdity of his argument for this invasion, sort of claiming that you have Ukrainians trying to stir up trouble and trying to provoke these pro-Russia forces. Why would Ukrainians do that when they have 200,000 Russian troops immobilized along the border?
Why are you hitting yourself, Ukraine? Why are you hitting yourself?
Right, exactly.
Yeah, he's even accused a Jewish man of being a neo-Nazi. It's quite shocking. I know you have limited time. We've taken an hour of your time, but we may talk about Pakistan. I think Imran Khan's gone on a tirade, and a lot of the discussion on local media is obviously seen with the lens of partisanship. If there's a pro-PMLN anchor, he's seen as touting the party line, whereas a pro-PTI anchor would obviously tout their own party line. As far as the US is concerned, are these brash statements seen by the Prime Minister of Pakistan seen as concerning, or they're also seen, as you put it, take no heed to what Biden said on the campaign trail? And despite being the Prime Minister, it seems like Imran Khan is now on a campaign trail. So when Imran Khan goes after NATO or goes after the US, are they taken seriously in the US, these statements?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a recognition in the US and in Washington, and this has long been Imran Khan's calling card. Anti-West populist rhetoric has been one of his core messages, along with anti-corruption, from the time he first entered politics in the 1990s. So I think that those in the administration that are sort of focusing on Pakistan now, and quite frankly, there's not many people in Washington focused on Pakistan now, other than those that cover Pakistan for a living. I think that they just see this as more par for the course, for sure. I think that there's just much more attention elsewhere, to be quite frank. So it's seen, and it is viewed as particularly sharp and strident. The way in which he took aim at the EU ambassadors in Islamabad that had issued that statement calling on Pakistan to condemn the invasion. That was, bring this idea that whether the EU thinks that Imran Khan is a slave of the EU. Yeah, that's pretty sharp rhetoric. It may not go over well. But again, I think that given his record as a politician, and given that there's so much of a precedent for this, I think that it really will be met with shrugs and not much else here in Washington, where again the focus is on other things. And should say it's not only Imran Khan. I mean, as you would know, over the years, many Pakistani leaders from many different parties have resorted to anti-West rhetoric, either because they genuinely believe in what they say, or simply because they know that that would play well within a broad subset of the population that tends to be very critical of the West, particularly in terms of its policies. You know, you go back to Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, of course, who I think is perhaps the most logical analog for the types of things that Imran Khan has been saying these days. But not just that, all of the parties, leaders from various parties. I mean, the PMLN, they had come out with some pretty nasty anti-West rhetoric at some point. So everyone does it, particularly Imran Khan, though.
Why should I sit here? I'm going back to my country. To hell with the Security Council. It's quite a moment for Pakistan. I think we take quite pride in that moment of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. So it might be water under the bridge. Water off a duck's back. I got confusing between the two metaphors. But there is an argument that's made on television in Pakistan that Imran Khan's comments, and particularly about the Taliban breaking the shackles of slavery, that ran on the front page, I believe, on the Washington Post, that ran, and that was quite concerning for US foreign policy experts. But his particular targeted remarks about Blinken and Biden being ignorant, there is an argument made that that's why Biden has not called Imran Khan and has sort of shunned Pakistan repeatedly, even when it came to inviting Pakistan on the climate conference, which they really should have, were the fourth or the fifth most affected country by climate change. So is it true that those statements were taken seriously, or the sidelining of Pakistan by the US, at least in terms of personal relationships between Biden and Imran Khan, there's more to it than just the statements of Imran Khan?
Yeah, I think there is more to it than just the statements. Certainly they don't help his cause in Washington with this administration. And of course that, Imran Khan had hit it off, so to speak, with the Trump administration to an extent, but that's only because Trump himself recognized that he needed Pakistan's help to get talks going with the Taliban.
And Pakistan's, I'm sorry, I'm cutting you, but Pakistan's predictions were of a Trump victory. So we did put all our eggs in terms of our foreign policy in the Trump basket, because locally the prediction was that Trump would win.
Right, exactly. Right. So anyway, Imran Khan, of course, was happy to deliver on that request to bring the Taliban to the table, and that helped him get the invitation to the White House. And he had what, from a public diplomacy, public relations angle, was a very successful trip to Washington. He met with all kinds of key people, not just Trump, but key congressional leaders and other members of the Trump cabinet. So that was great. But I think with the Biden administration, this is an administration that is populated by many old foreign policy hands who had served in the Biden and the Obama administration, including Biden, of course, and who were there at one of the most difficult periods for US-Pakistan relations, right? 2011, 2012, when all of those crises happened, Raymond Davis, Salala, bin Laden raid, and so on. So I think that those memories die hard. And I think that in that regard, President Biden is really in no hurry to try to build up a good relationship with Imran Khan, who happens to be someone that's been very critical of US policies at that very time when the relationship was so bad with the drones and other things as well. But so I don't think that the only reason why there hasn't been a phone call between Biden and Khan is because of some negative things that Khan has said about the US and about US political figures. I think it goes deeper than that. First of all, I think that the US did invite Pakistan to its White House Democracy Summit. And I think that was meant to be an olive branch, because indeed, as you noted, the US didn't invite Pakistan to the climate conference, which was not received well in Pakistan for good reason. Anyway, the US invited Pakistan to the Democracy Summit. Pakistan at the last minute backed out for reasons that have never been clear. I think that it thought that the whole thing was getting too political and anti-China, which would be accurate. But I think that was a blow, that is something that could have provided an opening had Pakistan participated in that conference. That could have provided an opening for the relationship and may have led to a greater likelihood of a call. But beyond that, another factor is that President Biden is not one who is going to pick up the phone and have a call with head of government in another country just to do it, just to say hi, so to speak. And that's what separates him from Trump. President Biden, he he sees the relationship, and the Biden administration sees the relationship with Pakistan as very transactional. So I think that he would only be ready to have a call if there's something, if there's an agreement to finalize, or if there's an achievement to celebrate. And there hasn't been anything like that, quite frankly. The U.S. has explored possible new agreements with Pakistan vis-a-vis counterterrorism in Afghanistan. I think that military basing is out, so that's not going to happen. But other opportunities like a new intelligence sharing agreement to allow Pakistan and U.S. to share intelligence about terror groups in Afghanistan. Nothing's happened there. So I think that gives Biden little reason to want to talk to Prime Minister Khan. But bottom line, final point on this, certainly Imran Khan doesn't help the cause of wanting a call with President Biden, if he still wants a call at this point, by saying the types of things that he said. The Taliban comment about the shackles of slavery being broken, that got such a big response only because it was such a traumatic, the Taliban takeover was such a traumatic event for the United States. And so obviously there's going to be a lot of attention paid to how key regional players react. So that's understandable. But I think the US has in many ways moved on from Pakistan. It's so focused on other things that it's just, I don't imagine that there's going to be a call anytime soon. I don't think that it would hurt. There's nothing wrong in doing it. But for the reasons I mentioned, I think it's unlikely we're going to see that call.
I mean, there's widespread acceptance now in the US academia as well that the drone program was horrendous and was inhumane. So I do, despite being this critical of Imran Khan and being known as a vocal critic of Imran Khan, I fully support his anti-drone movement. And I do agree that it's the drone program had a lot of collateral damage, even if the claims were made that it was safer than conventional bombing. Particularly the timing, and I do feel Putin played us like a fiddle. They knew they were going to invade Ukraine on that day, and they wanted it to show, wanted the world to see business as usual with Putin meeting world leaders. And I don't think we gained anything from that. But would you also put Imran Khan being in Moscow when Russia invaded Ukraine as just bad optics and nothing more than that, or that in particular is seen a lot more critically by world leaders around the world?
Yeah, so I know that this visit he made to Russia is a very sensitive issue for government supporters, and Insafians get so angry when I make this comment. But yeah, I agree with you. There was terrible optics for him to be there. It would have been different if he had gone there, a few weeks later. When he could have at that point, used the excuse to try to call for de-escalation, but he was literally there as the invasion was unfolding. And I just think that is just not good. And the good thing is that there were very few public aspects to the visit. Well, actually there were quite a few, but there weren't as many as there could have been. But for me, the worst optic was when Imran Khan was standing there shaking hands with President Putin. And then
what an exciting time to be here. What an exciting
the fact that there was a big story made about the long table, so to speak. Putin, this is where he really played Imran Khan. He had Imran Khan sit down right next to him. There was no big table to separate them. And so, one could argue, that's because maybe Imran Khan agreed to take a Russian PCR test, and so Putin was not as paranoid as he ordinarily would be and was willing to have Khan close to him. But I think that was the case of Putin trying to show that he sees Imran Khan as a friend, and that Putin still has friends, and he'll continue to have friends despite what he's doing in Ukraine. So that was very problematic. So yeah, the optics were bad, but I really think Pakistan had no choice. I think that to back out so suddenly at a moment when, at a time when the relationship with Russia is very important for Pakistan, even if there's not all that much to it, there's not much meat on the bones of that relationship, but it has been making progress. And, as I understand it, the plan was to discuss and perhaps even finalize some deals related to energy and so on. So I think that he had to make the trip, which is why it was just really bad luck. But I'm completely with you. I really think that that Putin may have purposely planned it this way. We had all heard that if there was going to be an invasion, it was going to happen soon after the Beijing Olympics ended. Imran Khan went to Moscow within a few days after the Beijing Olympics ended. So I think I was not surprised. Many were surprised. I was not surprised that he invaded, and I was not surprised that it had happened to coincide with Imran Khan's visit. It's unfortunate, but again, it comes down to bad luck for the Imran Khan government.
I do think Pakistan was pushed into a corner, and we didn't have any good options because the visit was scheduled. I think it was scheduled a few weeks prior to even the fog of war, or the idea that they might actually invade Ukraine. And maybe some calculations were that's a bluff and they won't actually invade. So once we accepted the visit, not going would have also looked terrible. And the statement that came out was quite measured. But again, Imran Khan's rhetoric is what gets him into trouble. I don't think any deal was signed, or there has been no evidence that a deal was signed of wheat coming in from Russia, but just to drum up political support. He said that. And then there were certain EU leaders that really rebuked that idea that war's going on and you're importing wheat from Russia, even though it's not happening.
Mm-hmm. Right. No, absolutely. I would say that I think that the trip, it would have been a diplomatic disaster to back out, but I also think that it was politically advantageous for Imran Khan to be there, because I think that allows him to sort of send a message of defiance to the West, and that can rally his base, his supporters. And this is what he's been trying to do, defy the West with his rhetoric, but in this case, with his visit to Russia, with his actions as well. Quite frankly, I think that sort of goes too far. That's not the best way to defy the West. But I think he did derive a fair amount of political mileage from his visit. I mean, naturally, his detractors and his critics went crazy and were furious with what he did. But I think what's more important to him is that he was able to rally his base, which I think, as I understand it, on many levels has grown so concerned because of the economic stress in Pakistan. So it was important for him to, for symbolic reasons, to show that he's not going to just cancel this visit just because the West wants him to. I think that's an important message for him to convey to his supporters.
Imran Khan is definitely putting Imran Khan before Pakistan, whether it means hurting the IMF program and this anti-American populism. And when I put it up that Michael's going to talk about that, somebody tweeted saying, then should we have pro-American populism? Those are not the two binaries that we're drawing. The idea is that it's only said because it sells. Imran Khan went to the IMF. Imran Khan now, based on IMF's recommendation, has ceded control of the state bank from Pakistan to essentially the IMF. It's a much bigger discussion, but that's my opinion. So you're actually handing over state institutions to the IMF, and it might be called International Monetary Fund, but it's closely controlled. Maybe controlled is too strong a word, but I'm going to stick to that, by the US. So at one point, you're passing ordinances, handing over the state bank to the US, and then going to your rallies and drumming up anti-Americanism, populism. That's the problem. And I completely agree with you. Him meeting Putin sets up the grounds that in case he's ousted, he can make a claim that it was a conspiracy by the CIA in America because he's anti-American, and that's why he was ousted. I know there is no truth to that, but since it's a popular theory in Pakistan, and the US is known to oust leaders around the world, most definitely. What would you say to Pakistanis who believe that the US is now interested in ousting Imran Khan?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And absolutely, I acknowledge why that conspiracy theory is so powerful. It's because, it is rooted in some realities of the past, right? I mean, we look at what's happened. If you go back to the really recent history, looking at the role the CIA has played in Pakistan. I mean, the fact that you had so many CIA operatives in Pakistan not too long ago, the fact, the whole Raymond Davis affair, and I think that the Afridi case, I mean, the idea of having a Pakistani doctor work with the CIA to track down. Yeah, right, exactly. I mean, I understand that the means justify the ends, or the end justifies the means sometimes. And I'm really happy that bin Laden was apprehended. Everyone should be happy about that. But that incident, I think, did so much to not just not shatter. It did so much to not only undermine US-Pakistan cooperation, but also to eliminate the possibility that there could be any hope of Pakistanis ever taking a more sanguine view of the CIA just because of that one incident. So I fully understand where Pakistanis are coming from when they sort of say, oh yeah, sure. Well, given what's happened in the past, why shouldn't we expect that the CIA is once again at work trying to oust Imran Khan? But what's different is that quite frankly, I mean, I don't mean to be blunt, but I think that in Pakistan there's a tendency to exaggerate the importance that Pakistan, and particularly Pakistani domestic politics, has in Washington. The U.S. has largely moved on, and especially since the withdrawal, there's not really much attention paid to domestic politics in Pakistan, in great part because the relationship with Pakistan is not in a pretty deep place right now. And at the end of the day, I think that even though this is not good for democracy in Pakistan, at the end of the day, when the U.S. really feels it needs to work closely with Pakistan and get things done and pursue deals, it knows who to go to. It confers with the army, and the army's not going anywhere. So engineering some type of regime change to bring in a new civilian administration, it wouldn't matter. In other words, the U.S. would have no incentive to see one particular civilian administration over the other, even though it may privately have its preferences. But naturally, it would be willing to work with whichever administration is in power. So yeah, that's my view, that yes, I can acknowledge why this idea would be out there given the precedent of the past, but the US simply doesn't pay much mind to Pakistan right now. It's not very focused on it. And also, the one data point that many Pakistanis have put out there is that you had, quote unquote, US ambassadors meeting with opposition members. And that must suggest some type of plan. Well, first of all, there hasn't been a US ambassador in Pakistan for several years. So you did have some senior US diplomats meeting with Mariam Nawaz Sharif several years ago, or last year, I believe. But this happens. This is what diplomats do. They don't only meet with the governments in the countries that they're based in. They meet with a lot of key political figures. And the Pakistani diplomats in Washington frequently meet with senior members of the Republican Party, the opposition. They meet with the opposition party. This is how diplomacy works. So that's why I would push back against that purported data point that many Pakistanis have put out there. My closing word on this is that I acknowledge where you're coming from, given what's happened in the past, but it's a whole new ballgame now. And what you suggest is proof that something is brewing is not proof at all, because it's totally normal for these things to happen, and it does not signify anything covert or behind the scenes or anything like that. But of course, if it's very clever politically for Imran Khan to do this, because if he survives a no confidence vote, he can say, well, look, I defied the West. And if he loses, he could essentially come up with this new narrative to say, well, look, the West, the Western-backed opposition pushed me out. We're gonna put together a campaign and come back to put these Western stooges to rest once and for all. So it's political genius.
But it's dangerous for the people, and not to say Islamophobia does not happen in the West. It absolutely does. But to make that a central tenet and to make that binary of everything in the West is terrible and wants to kill you, I think only does a lot to reawaken your own religious identity, and that often turns to violence. So it is a very, very dangerous rhetoric that Khan is engaging in, but he's doing it for his own politics as opposed to anything to do with the betterment of Pakistan. But it also shows what you're talking about, US's hypocrisy, that democracy is a central tenet of their foreign policy and is a central moral high ground that they take even while invading other countries. But they have repeatedly gladly worked with the military in Pakistan, even undercutting democratic regimes or the power of the democratic regime by dealing directly with the military. And Musharraf was arguably one of their closest allies. So this whole idea that the US is a supporter of democracy does not play out, especially when we look at their dealings with Pakistan.
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly the US, it certainly supports the idea of civilian democracy. And, you look at some of the assistance programs over the years, particularly at USAID, it provided support to boost capacity within the parliament. And there have been plenty of efforts in that role, also in terms of supporting Pakistani civil society. But yeah, when push comes to shove, who the US officials will go to if they feel they need to get something done.
I know we're out of time. If you have 10 minutes, can I do like really quick answers for the questions people asked?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Ask him about who will fill the power vacuum left in Afghanistan.
The power vacuum left in Afghanistan? Well, well, actually, I mean, there's no power vacuum, and the Taliban is in full control. They swept in, they eliminated any form of resistance, and what's left of the opposition to the Taliban has largely been displaced to Tajikistan. Certainly, maybe the question is getting to this idea of the region. Could we see a new great game in Afghanistan with the U.S. gone? Perhaps, but I don't buy into this narrative that eventually we're going to see China and Iran and other countries sort of step in to fill the vacuum left by the U.S. just because everyone's being very cautious. I think that everyone, including Pakistan, wants to get a better sense as to if the Taliban will be able to survive, what if anything, it'll be able to do about the various forms of terrorist threats in Afghanistan. So I think that these regional countries will hold back before actually agreeing to step in and provide a lot of money and build out infrastructure and so on. So I think everyone's taking a wait and watch approach for the near to midterm.
Can you please ask him, with the lack of presence in South Asia, except India, how does the USA see the growing influence of Russia and China with countries like Pakistan? I'm not sure how much Russia has influence over Pakistan, but definitely China.
Yeah, no, this is I think one of the big geopolitical stories of our times, that China has been expanding its presence far beyond its immediate neighborhood into South Asia. And I think that one of the big storylines in the coming years will be the competition between China and India. How does that play out? Because we've seen in many of the smaller states of South Asia, many of these states have historically had close ties to India, but China has moved in using the vehicle of the Belt and Road Initiative to develop more of a presence, develop more influence. But India has sought to push back by sort of stepping in and offering up its own assistance. This week, the Sri Lankan finance minister went to India to finalize this new $1 billion line of credit agreement. Sri Lanka had been getting a lot of financial support from China in recent years. So how that plays out will be very interesting. The Russia factor is fascinating in this regard. I think that many outside of South Asia don't realize that Russia actually is fairly popular, I think, on a sort of in terms of Russia doesn't have any enemies in South Asia, and it has varying forms of relations, very good with India to pretty cordial trade relations with Sri Lanka and Bangladesh. But there's the soft power effect as well. I mean, many South Asian students have studied in Russian universities. Now there's a pretty significant South Asian tourism industry in Russia as well. The one time I went to Russia a few years ago, I was struck by how many Indian tourists were there. So there's that. So I think that if Russia is going to be looking for new markets and opportunities to get around its heavily sanctioned self, I could see it trying to piggyback on China's activities in South Asia to try to develop more of a relationship, particularly on commercial levels, with some of these South Asian states, right? I mean, it's only natural.
I think this is the tweet that made me tell you that death, taxes, and trolls are inevitable. The tweet was, he projects Hindutva goons as well-wishers in South Asia. CAA 370, 35A and Kisad movement, his analysis and argument supports one side, that is the BJP view. Even if we post, the English is atrocious in this tweet, not that I should be language shaming anybody. Even if we post mostly about India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, but never share negative news when it comes to India.
Right.
How much does Raw pay you, Michael? How much does Raw pay you?
Yeah, I always like that type of trolling comment, just because I hear the exact opposite from Indian trolls who tell me that
about you being pro-Pakistani military as well, along with this.
Right. Yeah. One thing I've always thought it would be great to convene a Twitter space session where I can bring in all of the Pakistani trolls and the Indian trolls who target me and just let them battle things out. And I'll just sit there and listen and laugh. Yeah, I mean, as an analyst, I feel that I try to say things as they are. I'm not going to single out one country over the other. And naturally, since I'll be critical of both countries from time to time, naturally, for those that are really nationalistic, and a lot of these trolls are very nationalistic, they just can't stand when an outsider has something negative to say about their country. And the perception of not being negative enough about the enemy. Nothing I could do about that.
This is actually quite a good question. I would like you to ask him. China has deepened its economic engagement with Pakistan through elite-centered negotiations over routes and projects. CPEC, what does the USA have to offer to Pakistan other than aid? It's less anti-American and more national interest. Interesting point.
Yeah, so it is an interesting point. It's interesting that many in Pakistan have taken U.S. Opposition to CPEC as really a criticism of Pakistan, but in fact it's not. It's just part of the U.S.-China rivalry. And when Alice Wells very famously made her speech at the Wilson Center several years ago, in which she became the first senior U.S. official to publicly criticize CPEC, people forget about the second part of the speech, where she laid out in great detail how the U.S. could essentially be a better investor in Pakistan than China could. But certainly at the end of the day, I think that what the U.S. has to offer is not very much. Quite frankly, it has a vision about how it could provide more equitable, fair investments and things like that. But at the end of the day, the U.S. can't really hold a candle to what China has been able to do. And the fact that indeed China doesn't demand, it doesn't provide aid with as many conditions as the U.S. Does. It's very hard for the U.S. to get around that. And now, the U.S. has come out with this new policy. It's not a new policy, relatively new policy. This Indo-Pacific policy, which is in part meant to provide mechanisms and financial support for the development of infrastructure projects throughout Asia. But this doesn't apply to Pakistan because it's meant to counter China and push back against China. So the U.S. would not be able to justify committing all of these new resources to infrastructure development in Pakistan as part of the Indo-Pacific program, because it would be seen as anti-China, which is not what Pakistan wants. And so I just think that to the extent that the U.S. would want to ramp up its investment presence in South Asia, I think we'd be talking a lot more in the context of some of the smaller South Asian states, where there's this battle for competition between India and China. The U.S. would like to shape that competition so that it benefits India. And so it would want to try to develop closer relations with those countries to wean them away from China. Obviously, that's not a dynamic that applies in Pakistan, which of course has a deep alliance with Beijing.
Maybe a realpolitik answer to this would be advanced military technology, whether truly, well, yes, the US military technology is the most advanced in the world, but the Pakistan military is also used to it over the years. So the Pakistan military will always have an affinity towards the US and will want to be in the US camp, because apart from economic aid, there is also specifically military aid, and the Pakistani military definitely prefers that from the US over any other country. I know we're already hitting 90 minutes, so this is going to be the last question. Is anti-American rhetoric good for us? Gone through that detail. We've had the detailed discussion. Pakistan has always received foreign aid during national disasters, floods, earthquakes. Is this narrative good or bad for Pakistan-US friendship? I think the specific question is, doesn't this work for us? Ziaul Haq was, I think it is rumored that Ziaul Haq was negotiating with the US on foreign aid while orchestrating an attack on the American embassy and using that as a way to get more aid from the America. So doesn't this work for us?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I really, it's hard to answer that, and I don't really, I'm not really sure I'd buy into that. I'm not sure I'd buy into that idea, quite frankly. I think that yes, U.S. Well, I'm trying to think of a recent case study that I could tap into, and I can't really think of one. But no, I think that the U.S. has provided humanitarian assistance. Like during the earthquake, that terrible earthquake some years ago, U.S. assistance was forthcoming. But I'm not sure. I think that that's one case where you don't have to assume that there were conditions attached to it. I think that that's, and actually for that matter, it's a myth to say that that you have these heavy conditions on U.S. civilian and development assistance to Pakistan. There's certainly expectations about things that are done, but it's the security assistance where there's been more conditionality attached to it. This applies to the Kerry Lugar-Berman deal. When that deal was announced, there was this huge hullabaloo, as you'll recall, predicated on this idea that it was the civilian assistance that came at a huge cost, and so forth, the need to assert civilian supremacy over the military and all of that. But it was separate. The development assistance attached to the Kerry Lugar Berman bill did not come with heavy conditions. So at any rate, it's a good question that you pose, but I don't really I don't really have a good answer. I think that the U.S. likes to see its sort of episodic humanitarian assistance as serving an immediate cause of bringing humanitarian relief to a country where, of course, we have seen far-right militant groups oftentimes step into the fray and provide assistance when the state, particularly the civilian leadership, is not in a position to provide that assistance.
I mean, if the US wants to support podcasts in Pakistan, patreon.com/the Pakistan experience.
That's something else that I'll pass on to the relevant authorities here. That and your Russian vodka request.
I'd prefer the vodka over the Patreonship. But thank you so much, Michael. I think it's an interesting discussion. And I think global politics, especially right now, are ever changing. And we can't truly predict, but this probably helped understand it better. Thank you so much, Michael, for coming on.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Always a pleasure to talk to you. And thank you for listening. Take care. Bye-bye.